I am live. I'm reading out of Return to Elysium. I'm now in the third part of this far memory book by Joan Grant. I just read the first chapter of this new part, which was entitled The Stream. And we are now at chapter 2 of part 3, entitled The River. This is Joan Grant's life as Lucina, 2nd century BC. Marius was playing with Flavia in the garden. I called to him, but he was too intent on his name to hear me. "Don't disturb him," said Euripides. "Can't you be content to leave him now that you know he is happy?" Marius, can't you leave your game long enough to listen to your mother?" He dropped the ball he had been going to throw and looked around as though he were frightened. "Don't let him see you," said Euripides urgently. "Can't you understand it would be disgustingly selfish?" I let him pull me into the shelter of a statue of Hermes. "Watch the child from here if you want to, but don't upset him. You promised not to disturb him if I let you see for yourself that he is happy. Lucina, you must learn to keep your promises." "I didn't know I had promised," I said forlornly. "It seems so little to ask, just to kiss my own child before I go away." "You should have thought of that sooner." Euripides sounded severe, yet not unkind. I saw Marius begin to cry. I nearly ran towards him. Then I saw the expression on Flavia's face as she took him in her arms to comfort him. "Take me away, Euripides. Take me away. There is nothing to keep me here any longer. Flavia knows much more about being a mother than I was ever able to learn. Take me away before I cry or start feeling jealous instead of grateful, while I still have the decency to be glad Marius is happier without me." "Are you still determined to see Nigellus?" "Yes, I might worry about him if I wasn't sure he is all right." "Would it do if you saw him making a speech in the Senate, or would you prefer the Forum?" "How do I know where he is? How do I know where he is? Perhaps the litter bearers will know. They knew where to find Marius." Euripides would not let me look out between the drawn curtains while we went through the streets of Rome. There was very little chance of our being recognized, but he was so insistent that I did not bother to argue. Nigellus was making a speech in one of the public squares. There was a crowd listening to him, but Euripides hurried through the press of people so fast that I was not sure whether they were hostile or friendly. Nigellus was standing on some stone steps which led up to a large building, perhaps a new temple, as it had not been there in my time. He looked well in his yellow toga with a purple border. Either his hair had grown, or else the laurel wreath concealed his increasing baldness, for he looked younger than I expected. I was not close enough to hear what he was saying, or perhaps I was so used to the sound of his voice that habit made me forget to listen to the words. Anyway, it was probably on a subject which I should have considered irrelevant. I stayed until I heard the crowd cheering him. Dear Nigellus, he had been starved of cheers, and now he could have his fill. Knowing that I could leave him without feeling guilty made me quite fond of him again. "Satisfied," said Euripides. "Any regrets?" "No regrets, and thank you for letting me see him." Euripides looked very pleased with himself, as though he had done something clever. I could not understand why, for it had been I who insisted on visiting Nigellus, and he had done everything he could to prevent me. Perhaps he had always been a little jealous, and was glad I felt so unmoved at this farewell to my husband, for in my mind it was a farewell. I told the litter bearers to take us to the harbour. I thought Euripides was going to protest, but after a moment's hesitation, he got in beside me. For some reason best known to himself, he did not draw the curtain. I could look on to scenes which once had been so familiar. The Tiber was in flood. Refuse was swirling down on the turbid water. The waves against the piers of the bridges might have been carved from yellow stone. The quays were not so busy as usual, but a cluster of masts against the sky showed that we should not have to wait long for a boat. "Shall we visit your temple?" Euripides sounded casual, as though the matter were of small importance. No, I said, I don't see any point in going back there, and Salonius might recognize me, which would be embarrassing. Frightened? Of course not. I only think it would be rather boring. But you told me there might be a ghost there. We shouldn't leave any unnecessary ghosts in Rome. I'm not sure I believe in ghosts. Anyway, I've outgrown the phase of being interested in the supernatural. I'm going to look after myself for a change. And you, of course. We must look after each other. Then we will most certainly visit the temple. You said the ghost was one of the Lucinas. She must be feeling lonely, poor dear, and I think we had better take her with us back to Elysium. If I ever said anything so silly it was meant as a joke, how could I have left her there when I'm here? Such a very solid here. For a moment I felt peculiar and took hold of the side of the litter to reassure myself that it was made of ordinary painted wood and not part of an elaborate dream. One of the litter bearers had a wart on the back of his neck. There can be something very reassuring in the sight of a wart. Well, I shall go there, he said stubbornly. Well, I shall go there, he said stubbornly. If you think it would be too difficult for you to use some of your old powers, though why you are deliberately pretending you never possessed any I simply can't understand, I shall go alone, and you can stay on the bank by yourself, and I hope it rains. I think if I had not seen the heavy drops splashing on the cobbles, I might have stayed behind, but I should look silly if I got soaked. It might be quite amusing to go to the temple. In any case, it would probably make me feel better. If it were abandoned, I should know for certain that Salonius had failed to find anyone to take my place. And if there were another woman there, she was probably quite inadequate, and it would be amusing to make funny remarks about her, so that Euripides could laugh with me. It was a slightly uncomfortable thought. How easy it would be to be funny about a priestess, even one who was quite sincere. All those robes and dim lights and the poppy drink, and the awful solemnity of it all. Had any of my patients wanted to laugh? Not many of them. I was startled, not realizing I'd expressed my thoughts aloud. Your sincerity was too obvious for any of them to have laughed when you were working properly, said Euripides consolingly. Of course, when you weren't really trying, you might have seemed silly. But I think few of them were oblivious of the fact that you had got power of a kind, and it might have turned it against them if you grew angry. The risk of being cursed by an impudent priestess is a considerable strain on the most robust sense of humour. If they had realized how funny they looked, lying on the couch and sipping that perfectly harmless draught, as though it were hemlock. I told you not to mention it again. He raised his hand as though he were going to slap me. Then he laughed with an obvious effort and said, Sorry, forget it. Not at all important. What's the matter? Why shouldn't I say they looked funny? You said I did, which was unkind and probably quite untrue. At least, I sincerely hope it was. Forget it, Lucina. You must learn to take a hint instead of asking awkward questions, which won't get you any of the right answers. Abruptly he changed the subject. I think that when we learn to laugh at ourselves, we shall have gone a long way towards Olympus. Perhaps that's the greatest difference between immortals and the rest of us, the ability to laugh at ourselves without rancor. I was glad that he found an abstract idea to cover what had seemed an awkward situation. Perhaps, if he got sufficiently interested, he would forget about the temple, for surely these sentimental journeys were in the worst taste. So I said, We have been assured that laughter resounds throughout Olympus, but I always thought it was because the gods found the behavior of mortals supremely ridiculous. I must admit that I agree with them, especially when humans are trying to think themselves sublime in the act of love. Did you think yourself funny when you were in bed with Nigellus? I giggled. Not always. And not me, really. But at times I couldn't help imagining what we would look like to someone sitting on the ceiling, all those curves and antics. Sometimes I used to imagine he was wearing a toga, with his laurel wreath hanging over one ear, and that he would suddenly realize there was a crowd watching him, us, I mean, who were patiently waiting for him to make a speech about the latest war or something equally pompous. How amusing that must have been for your husband. No wonder he grew old so quickly. No wonder he's glad to be rid of you. Surely we needn't be sarcastic in a friendly argument. Euripides, please don't be tiresome. It spoils everything when we have to quarrel. You can pretend that I'm a normal, difficult male. Vastly your inferior, of course, who loses his temper without any just cause and is completely irrational. But if you go on talking with smug satisfaction about how you behaved disgustingly to a man who, with all his faults, and I will admit he was infuriatingly solemn on occasions, loved you sincerely and to the full measure of his capacity, I shall turn you over my knee and smack you. May it make you realize you are talking like a spoiled child, and not a very nice child either. It was a good row, and I was thoroughly enjoying myself. Of course, if you want to resort to your masculine advantage of physical strength, there is nothing I can do. If you want a woman who will wrestle with you, why didn't you choose a Roman girl? Those fat arms and thighs are not nearly so pliable as they look. It's not your fault, really, he said and sighed. I knew him well enough to adjust myself for a more subtle attack. None of us had the sense to bully you when we saw you were going in the wrong direction. All we did was to bleat to each other like a lot of silly sheep and hang about waiting to help you when you got yourself into real trouble. We let you do as you pleased with us. Even Asclepius never had the courage to tell you what he really thought of you. And Salonius, poor Salonius, what a fool you made of him. In the end, he was too scared to do anything except argue with you in a feeble sort of way. After you gave boils to the patrician who said rude things about you, which was exceedingly stupid, as I'm afraid you will discover before long, he never put up at any adequate opposition to anything you did. They were only very small boils, I said soothingly. I had never felt entirely comfortable about this minor departure from the laws I had invented for my own behaviour, and was startled that I had ever confessed it to anyone. Two on the back of his fat neck and one between the eyebrows, to remind him that there is more to be seen through the forehead than he would ever recognise with his small piggy eyes. I'm glad to hear it, for I expect you will make a fuss when they catch up with you. I hope they remind you to look out of your third eye. It can't see less than the other two do. I put my hands furtively on the back of my neck to see if it felt sore, but luckily it did not. I think it very unkind of you to suggest boils on me. Salonius always said it was very unwise to imagine oneself in anything but perfect health, and I never realized how sensible of him it was. Salonius was sensible sometimes. It was really rather a pity I didn't take more notice of him. Humility from Lucina? Real or false? Aren't you being needlessly disagreeable? Do you think I am incapable of humility? Is it my fault that I met so few people in Rome with whom it was decent to feel humble? You wouldn't have me grovel to my inferiors, would you? After all, we are Athenians, and so, of course, immune from the laws which govern the conduct of less fortunate mortals. Well, you can't expect us to be bound by standards which were invented to control foreigners. They can't help being different, poor things. It's just that they have not evolved so far as we have. Lucina, do try to use your imagination. When it was uncomfortable for us, you were never at a loss of an unlikely idea, and now, when it might be useful, you're intolerably conventional, earthy, in the worst sense. I knew he was going to start nagging me about the ghost, so I said, I'm ready to go to the temple. The river looks rather high, so I hope we find a reliable boat. I expected a boat, but not a boat with Lucius at the steering oar. He greeted me without surprise, as though I were part of the ordinary routine. I thought it rather impertinent of him not to be glad to see me, so I did not ask him where he was living or inquire after Iris. "You had better go alone," said Euripides. "I'll come if you want me, but unless you do it, I'd rather stay here. Crossing a river often makes me sick." I knew this was nonsense. He had been fond of sailing in rough weather. When a storm blew up, he was always the last to suggest turning back. But if he thought I was going to implore him to come with me, he was mistaken. The waves broke over the long brow, and yellow water swirled over my feet. The boat rocked dangerously, and I'd nearly told Lucius to turn back. The storm must have been worse than any I remembered, for even in rough weather the passage to the island had been sheltered. It seemed much longer than before, and I knew it was only 200 paces, less if you steered across the current. At last Salonius had not allowed the island to fall into disrepair. The stone flags of the path were free from moss, and none of the oak trees had been attacked by ivy. So he had found someone to take my place. It would be amusing to see if she were genuine. I would go there as a patient and ask for her advice. I would even pretend to take the poppy drink. I pushed open the door and saw that the lamp was lit beside the couch. How well I knew the correct procedure. I took off my sandals and lay back against the violet cushions, pleased that the new priestess had not been allowed to alter the decorations. I could see a female shape through the gaze curtains. She wore a robe similar to mine in colour. It was probably one of those Narcissus had designed. Salonius must have decided that new ones would be a needless extravagance. I could show her that I was familiar with the routine, which would make her try her hardest, for she would think I had been here before to Lucina, her rival. "I've come to plead for your advice and counsel before making a long journey." How easy it was to echo the phrases I had so often heard. "I lost my husband and my child, and now I want to go back to the place where I was born. I want to know whether I shall make a safe journey, whether I shall find my home as I left it many years ago." "You will find the home you made. There is no other, however long the journey." She must have read my notes, for I had certainly used that phrase before. Surely Salonius could have found someone with more originality. "In the multiplicity of Roman gods, I am undecided to whom I could make a votive offering before embarking," I said. "If you make it to any one save Apollo, you do so at your peril. Follow your heart. All other roads lead to disaster." This was too much. The exact words I had used to Cordelia, who had so recently befriended me. But I would give her one more testing. "Shall I agree to travel in the company of slaves? It may be that I can find no other boat which sails tonight." "Why should you be too proud to travel with slaves? There's no just pride except in integrity." The advice I'd given to Iris when she could not decide to marry Lucius. It was disgraceful of Salonius to have taken Iris' faithful recordings of my utterances and handed them to this creature to abuse. I got up from the couch, my hands shaking with righteous indignation. I pulled back the curtain so roughly that the silver rings clattered like the bones of skeleton fingers. The other woman must have been young to be so agile. Already she had escaped through the door into the robing room. If she thought I was going to indulge in an undignified game of hide and seek round the island, she was due for a sharp disappointment. The silver ram's heads felt very familiar to my hands, almost as though I had never left this throne, this lonely throne. I must have been much more tired than I realized, for my legs went to sleep. When I tried to get up, I could not move. It was not cramp, for there was no pain. Only a heaviness, a disobedience of the body, which was rather alarming. It would pass off in a moment. How fortunate that there was no one to see me in this ridiculous situation. I tried to force myself upright by leaning my weight on my hands. The fingers remained flexed, as though I had deliberately relaxed. I could watch them, calm and unresponsive, long and pale against the silver of the rams. I began to get delusions. I thought I was going to see the door open and Nigellus enter for the first time. It would be terrible if I saw him like that, and had to love him again. Yes, again, for I had loved him, until love became inconvenient to acknowledge. It was only when I began to regret the temple, to feel myself futile as a mistress, that I learned to hate him, so that I could put the blame for my escape on his shoulders. It had been difficult to learn hate, for I had had a terrible persistence of scholarship. "Don't come here near Nigellus," I said, as though he was really waiting outside the door. "We shall only hurt each other again. You are too kind to break the cruelty in me, too young to challenge the aged, too dishonest to make me see myself." The door slammed shut. It must have been the wind which had swayed it open. Then the wind played another trick on me. It made the noise of a crowd. Many people sighing because they were lonely or heartsick or bewildered. None of their sickness was too heavy for me to carry until they were strong again. If they would only open the door and come into the light of the lamp, I should be able to talk to them. I should not ask them to lie on the couch or follow any of the ritual. I should just talk to them in small ordinary words, for their problems would be things I had learned by ordinary living. I should not have to use the words Salonis had taught me, nor the phrases of philosophy. I should say, "I know what you feel. I know how difficult it seems, but you are not alone if you will only remember you are loving. It does not matter what you love. If you cannot think of any special person, or an animal will do, or even a plant, think back over your life and find someone, something you loved more than yourself, even if it were only for an hour." Somehow I should find the words to make them understand how vitally important this was. Just loving. Gods or people or things, it did not matter. It was not a truth which could break down disbelief like a sword, as logic can. It had not the colour of emotion, which people follow like a scarlet banner, without asking where they are going. It was so simple, so real, that no one bothered to look for it in the right place. They all knew it in their hearts, if only I could remind them it was there. Suddenly, slowly, the door opened. I waited for the press of people who at last had come home to see me. But a girl came through the door, as she had so often come before. Iris smiled at me. "I have brought you a cloak to wear on the ship," she said. "It's an old cloak. You gave it to me when I went to meet Lucius among the oak trees. You used to wear it when you first came here, but now you need it for your journey, and Lucius will make me another. I shall never be cold with Lucius." She wrapped the cloak around me and then took my hand to lead me out of the temple to the landing stage where Lucius waited to take me back across the river. Across the river where Euripides waited for the sailing of the ship by which exiles find their home. Oh, and this is the end. The third chapter is entitled The Sea. Bye-bye.